On December 20th, 1943, high above the icy expanse of northern Germany, the American 8th Air Force launched one of its most daring daylight raids of the war. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators droned eastward in formation, their silver wings glinting against the winter sky. Their mission was nothing less than to cripple the German industrial heart, ball-bearing factories, aircraft assembly plants, and chemical works that kept Hitler's war machine alive. But there was a problem. The Allies had no long-range escort fighters that could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. The Axis pilots knew it, and they mocked the lumbering formations as flying coffins, easy prey for the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. That morning, as contrails stretched across the heavens, the Luftwaffe prepared to pounce, confident that the American gamble on daylight precision bombing would collapse in flames once again. For the crews inside the bombers, each mile deeper into German airspace was a descent into terror. They had heard the laughter in Nazi propaganda, seen newsreels boasting about Allied losses, and yet the United States persisted, wave after wave of bombers sent without the shield of fighters to guard them all the way home. Many believed the strategy would break. What they didn't know, as they braced against flak and swarms of fighters, was that a new machine was about to rewrite the story of the skies. A fighter with speed, range, and firepower that would silence the mockery and turn fear into fury. The North American P-51 Mustang was coming, and with it, the question of who truly ruled the skies over Europe would finally be answered. The sound was always the first thing that struck them, the endless droning thunder of engines that seemed to vibrate through the bones, through the steel of the fuselage, through the very air itself. It was the heartbeat of the mission. Hundreds of Wright Cyclone and Pratt & Whitney radial engines pounding out their rhythm in synchronized defiance. To the bomber crews strapped into their cramped stations, it was a reminder that they were not alone, that the sky around them was filled with brothers in arms, each man playing his part in a deadly orchestration. But it was also a sound that carried dread, for every German ear tuned to the low, steady growl knew exactly what it meant. On the ground below, the children of Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg had come to recognize that sound as a precursor to chaos. And above them, in the clear, bitter cold of 25,000 feet, Luftwaffe pilots prepared to exploit the one weakness that made the Allied strategy seem suicidal: lack of protection. For all their bravery, the bombers were alone in the kill zone, slow-moving giants locked in rigid formation, their guns bristling, but their range limited by the arc of human endurance. And when the Germans came, they came with speed and precision, like wolves tearing into a herd that had wandered too far into enemy territory. Inside the cockpits of B-17s, the men tried to ignore the gnawing awareness that their own leaders had accepted these losses as part of the grand arithmetic of war. They had been told that precision bombing by daylight would shatter the Reich's ability to produce weapons, that every mission brought Germany one step closer to collapse. Yet what precision meant in practice was flying straight into a gauntlet, steady and predictable, because bombs could only strike true if dropped from a stable platform. That stability made them targets, and the Germans knew exactly how to exploit it. They swarmed from above, diving in from the sun with cannons blazing, their yellow-nosed Messerschmitts screaming toward the formations. The Americans returned fire with their .50 caliber Brownings, tracers streaking through the sky like furious fireflies. Sometimes a German fighter would erupt in flames and tumble earthward in a spiral of smoke, and the men would cheer briefly. But for every enemy they downed, more appeared, pressing relentlessly, probing weak spots, hammering the bombers until engines sputtered, wings tore, and silver giants fell burning into the farmland below. The press back home didn't see the full scale of it. Newspapers spoke of courage, of progress, of vital blows struck at the heart of Hitler's empire. Families were told their sons had died for a noble cause, that the bombing campaign was weakening the enemy. Yet in the ready rooms of the 8th Air Force in 1943, the truth was etched on every face. Losses were catastrophic, dozens, sometimes more than 60 bombers in a single raid, each carrying 10 men. Those who survived the flaming descent into the fields of Bavaria or Saxony often found themselves beaten, stripped, and marched into captivity, their war over. For the rest, still flying, there was no choice but to keep going, keep loading into the trembling bellies of the flying fortresses and liberators, keep watching friends vanish in blossoms of fire. All the while, Axis radio mocked them, German broadcasters sneering that the skies belonged to the Luftwaffe, that the Americans were wasting lives chasing an impossible dream of daylight dominance. The laughter wasn't always audible, but the men could feel it, in the boldness of German attacks, in the terrifying precision with which they picked off bombers one after another. And yet, even in the blood and fire, there was defiance. The formations were designed not merely for offense, but for survival, each bomber overlapping its fields of fire to create a defensive wall of lead. Gunners yelled coordinates and shouted through frozen oxygen masks, pivoting turrets to track incoming fighters, firing bursts into the void, hoping to carve gaps in the waves of attackers. It was brutal, exhausting work. Hours spent staring into icy wind, at silhouettes flashing by at hundreds of miles per hour, knowing that the slightest lapse could mean death for 10 men aboard. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes formations emerged battered but intact, having held together through sheer discipline and overlapping firepower. But more often, the German tactic of concentrated strikes found its mark, ripping open holes in the Great Armada until the carefully constructed geometry of protection unraveled. Once the formation fractured, the slaughter became inevitable. Lone bombers were easy prey. The laughter from the German side was not just propaganda anymore. It was confidence. A cold assurance that the Reich still owned the skies over its homeland. The problem gnawed at Allied commanders night after night. Precision bombing had been the promise, the American contribution to the combined bomber offensive, distinct from Britain's nighttime area bombing. Where the RAF flattened cities under the cover of darkness, the US had sworn it could cripple Germany with surgical daylight strikes. But the daylight meant visibility, and visibility meant vulnerability. Without fighters that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back, the missions became massacres. Spitfires and Thunderbolts tried, but their range fell short. They could shepherd the bombers across the Channel, sometimes even into the heart of France, but as soon as fuel demands forced them to turn back, the Luftwaffe was waiting. It was a bitter rhythm, safety for the first leg, then sudden exposure, a predator's feast, and a desperate crawl back toward the protection of returning escorts. The crews knew it, counted the minutes until their guardians had to peel away, braced themselves for the storm that followed. They didn't curse the Spitfires or P-47s. The men who flew them were brave. Their machines formidable, but range was the enemy. And range was what Germany exploited mercilessly. It was in this crucible of fire and loss that whispers of a new fighter began to circulate. A machine with long legs, with the speed to run down a German ace, and the stamina to cross all of Europe and back again. At first, it sounded like fantasy, the kind of rumor men told themselves to cling to hope. But test flights in England were proving something remarkable. A British request for more fighters had led North American Aviation to design a plane from scratch in just 117 days. The result was the Mustang, sleek and low, its lines suggesting speed even while at rest. Early versions had limited engines, but when married to the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the aircraft transformed. Suddenly, it could fly higher, faster, farther than anyone had thought possible. Suddenly, the equation began to change. For now, in 1943, most bomber crews had yet to see one. They still flew missions without that lifeline. But in the hangars and on the airfields of England, a new chapter was being written. What made the Mustang extraordinary was not simply performance. It was what performance meant for the men dying over Germany. For the first time, There was a fighter that could climb alongside the bombers, push deep into hostile territory, and still have the fuel to tangle with enemy interceptors. It was not a dream anymore. It was a reality waiting to be unleashed. And when it was, the laughter that had echoed through Nazi radio broadcasts would wither into silence. Until then, every mission carried the same terrible rhythm. Take off into icy winds, climb to altitude, formation tightening into a fortress of wings, the drone of engines filling the void, the brief security of escorts peeling away reluctantly, and then the sudden chaos of German fighters streaking in like blades. Every man on those missions knew the odds, and every man flew anyway. They weren't thinking about history or strategy, or even victory in the grand sense. They were thinking about each other, about doing their duty, about making it through one more raid. And in that, there was a kind of quiet heroism, even as the Axis laughed at the hopelessness of bombers alone. When the winter of 1943 bled into the spring of 1944, the skies above Europe were already a graveyard of twisted metal, smoke trails, and parachutes that fluttered like dying birds across the horizon. Each raid was a roll of the dice, and for too many crews, the gamble ended in fire. Yet something was stirring, a shift that even the Luftwaffe's most seasoned aces couldn't quite anticipate. It began quietly, squadrons of sleek new fighters appearing alongside the bomber streams, their silhouettes unfamiliar to many German eyes. They were long and lean, with a fuselage that seemed to stretch further than the stubby Thunderbolts and Spitfires. The men inside the bombers noticed them too. The first time a Mustang slid into formation, its canopy flashing in the sunlight, its presence felt almost unreal, like a guardian angel conjured out of the bitter cold. The crews craned their necks to stare, marveling at the beauty of the new aircraft, its propeller slicing the thin air with a confident roar. It wasn't just the machine, it was what it symbolized. For the first time, perhaps, the promise of protection did not seem like a cruel illusion. The Luftwaffe was quick to test this new arrival. German aces were not easily impressed. They had already faced the RAF's best and proven their skill against countless challengers. But when they pressed their attacks on the bomber formations now, something was different. The Mustangs didn't just fly escort for a few hundred miles before peeling away. They stayed, and when the Germans dove in, the P-51s turned to meet them head-on. The first engagements were shocking for the Reich's pilots. The Mustangs could climb with them, turn with them, chase them down even as they tried to disengage. What had once been the Luftwaffe's comfort zone, the deep interior skies where American bombers had always been most vulnerable, was now contested. Suddenly, the hunters found themselves hunted. German fighters, accustomed to dictating the terms of battle, now looked over their shoulders and saw sleek Mustangs filling their rearview mirrors. The myth of Luftwaffe dominance cracked, and with each mission the fracture widened. For the bomber crews, the change was visceral. Men who had once clenched their teeth, counting the minutes until the escorts turned back, now began to breathe differently. It wasn't that the danger disappeared. Flak still burst around them in black puffs, enemy fighters still slashed into their ranks, but there was a sense at last that someone was watching their backs. The Mustangs didn't just escort. They prowled, sweeping far ahead of the bomber streams, cutting into Luftwaffe bases before German fighters even had a chance to climb to altitude. It was as though the air war had flipped from reactive defense to aggressive offense overnight. A bomber gunner, who once braced for inevitable waves of Me-109s and FW-190s, might now look out and see American fighters diving on the attackers before they reached the formation. For the first time, the laughter that had echoed from German propaganda rings felt hollow. Axis radio still blustered, still promised invincibility, but the voices were thinner now, less certain. Yet the arrival of the P-51 was not just a tactical shift, it was psychological. War is fought as much in the mind as in the body, and for months, perhaps years, the Luftwaffe had carried itself with a swagger that came from knowing it held the upper hand. Allied losses reinforced that arrogance, feeding into the image of German invincibility. But the Mustang challenged that at its core. Every time a German ace who had boasted of dozens of kills found himself outflown, outgunned, or even shot down, the myth bled away. And myths once broken are hard to repair. Young Luftwaffe pilots, once eager to prove themselves, began to whisper about the new American fighter that seemed to defy odds. Bomber crews, who had once doubted the strategy of daylight raids, began to believe again, to see purpose in their suffering. For the men in the air, it was like watching the tide turn in real time. For the commanders on the ground, it was validation of a gamble that had seemed reckless just months earlier. Of course, the Mustang's arrival did not mean instant victory. The Luftwaffe fought back with the desperation of a cornered predator. They threw everything they had: ace squadrons, experimental tactics, new variants of aircraft bristling with cannons. They concentrated attacks. They launched head-on assaults. They even tried ramming when ammunition failed. But the balance of attrition had shifted. Germany could no longer replace its losses as easily as before, and every pilot downed was a blow they could ill afford. Meanwhile, the United States, with its vast industrial base, churned out Mustangs by the hundreds, training new pilots to fill their cockpits. The skies that had once favored the Reich now tilted toward the Allies, not by chance, but by the cold, relentless mathematics of resources and innovation. And yet, even as the war machine churned, what mattered most to those who lived through it were the moments when a Mustang swooped in, guns blazing, and saved a bomber that would otherwise have fallen. Those moments were seared into memory, told and retold in mess halls, whispered in letters home, recalled decades later by men who still remembered the sight of the sleek silhouette flashing through the sky. The bomber streams still paid in blood. Missions to Berlin, to Leipzig, to the oil fields of Ploiești still cost lives and machines in staggering numbers. But there was a difference now. Where once the formations had been mocked as defenseless giants stumbling to slaughter, now they moved with the quiet assurance that they were part of a greater system, one where fighters and bombers worked together in a deadly partnership. The P-51s were not perfect. They were fragile compared to the rugged Thunderbolts, and a single hit could bring them down. But their speed and range made them indispensable. They became the spearhead of daylight bombing, a symbol of American resolve that Germany could no longer laugh away. When Luftwaffe pilots looked up and saw Mustangs wheeling above the formations, they knew the fight had changed. No longer was it a one-sided hunt. It was a duel, and increasingly, it was a duel the Reich was losing. Perhaps the most profound testament to the Mustang's impact was the change in the faces of the men who flew the bombers. Veterans who had once stared hollow-eyed at empty bunks after missions began to see more men coming back, more planes limping home instead of spiraling down. Survival rates climbed, and with them morale. It did not erase the losses. Nothing could, but it gave meaning to the sacrifice, gave a sense that they were finally gaining the upper hand. Commanders who had once worried that the bomber offensive might collapse altogether began to see momentum. And across Europe, in occupied cities watching the endless streams of silver wings passing overhead, the presence of Mustangs was a whisper of hope that liberation was not just possible, but imminent. The war in the skies was never clean, never simple. It was a brutal chess game played in 3 dimensions, with human lives as the pieces. But the introduction of the P-51 Mustang reshaped that board. What had once been a field of Axis dominance became contested, then tilted, then dominated by Allied air power. The laughter of German propaganda grew fainter, swallowed by the roar of Merlin engines echoing through the high, thin air. In the end, it was not just about a machine. It was about what that machine enabled, the fulfillment of a strategy once deemed impossible, the survival of countless crews, and the steady march toward victory in Europe. And though those skies are silent now, the memory of the moment when the hunters became the hunted still lingers, a testament to how a single weapon in the right hands can alter the fate of nations. By the spring of 1944, the transformation of the air war was unmistakable. For nearly 2 years, the Axis had laughed at the boldness, some said recklessness, of America's daylight bombing campaign. They had called the lumbering B-17s flying piñatas, and the crews suicidal dreamers. German newspapers bragged of invincible pilots who carved apart Allied formations at will. But now, as the long days returned to the European skies, the tone of that laughter began to falter. The Luftwaffe's vaunted aces were being hunted. The airfields that once roared with the confidence of German might now shuddered under sudden attacks from swarms of Mustangs that seemed able to appear anywhere, at any hour. Pilots who once swaggered in leather jackets, boasting of kills, began to return shaken or not at all. And for the bomber crews, each mile flown was no longer only a journey into terror, but a journey with a chance of survival. They still faced the flak towers of Hamburg and the cannon fire of Messerschmitts. But now there were moments when salvation appeared out of the blue. A silver-skinned Mustang, diving like a hawk, guns blazing, scattering attackers before they could rip another bomber apart. The shift was not lost on the men themselves. Veterans who had flown the early raids to Schweinfurt or Regensburg remembered the helplessness, the long stretch of sky when escorts had peeled away and the Luftwaffe descended in fury. Now as they climbed into their bombers for missions to Berlin, Merseburg or Dresden, they did so with the knowledge that they were not entirely abandoned. They had seen the Mustangs. They had watched them streak across the sky, heard the chatter over the radio as fighter pilots announced they were going down after a bandit, felt the adrenaline surge when a P-51 cut across the bomber stream in hot pursuit of a German fighter. It was a revelation. The Luftwaffe could be challenged in its own airspace, where once it had ruled unopposed. And that revelation bled into morale, into discipline, into the willingness to climb into a plane, knowing you might have to fly straight through hell. Still, the cost remained staggering. Missions over Germany were never bloodless, never safe. The black blossoms of flak tore holes through wings and flesh, turning cockpits into death traps in seconds. German fighters still struck with ruthless precision, often in head-on attacks that sent rounds shattering through plexiglass noses, cutting down bombardiers before they could release their payloads. Even with Mustangs overhead, bomber crews knew their odds were harsh. Some squadrons still lost a quarter of their planes in a single mission. Yet what had changed was the belief that these losses were not in vain. Before, there had been doubt that the daylight strategy could work, doubt that the war in the skies was anything but a slaughter. But now, with Mustangs keeping watch, there was a sense of inevitability, a grim confidence that the sacrifice was finally breaking Germany's back. Each raid tore deeper into the industrial heart of the Reich, crippling oil production, disrupting rail lines, scattering factories into rubble. And each raid was now shielded, not just by courage, but by the sleek silhouette of America's new champion. The Luftwaffe responded with fury. They sent up waves of fighters, desperate to claw back control. They armed planes with heavier cannons, even fitted rockets designed to scatter bomber formations with a single hit. They trained young boys, barely out of their teens, and thrust them into cockpits to replace the veterans who never returned. Yet nothing could stem the tide. The Reich's fuel supplies were dwindling under relentless bombing, and the pilots who took to the skies often found themselves outnumbered, outflown, and outgunned by the Mustangs. The legend of Luftwaffe invincibility began to unravel. German civilians, once confident in their air defenses, watched in shock as Allied bombers thundered over cities with less and less opposition. The laughter that had once echoed from Axis propaganda offices grew brittle, strained, replaced more and more by grim silence or desperate pleas for endurance. For the Mustang pilots themselves, the mission was clear but never simple. They were young men, many barely 20, thrown into duels where a single mistake meant fire and death. They chased enemy fighters at dizzying speeds, felt the shudder of their own planes as 50-caliber guns roared, watched opponents erupt into smoke or slam into the ground in fiery wrecks. They also lost friends, wingmen who vanished in sudden explosions, squadron mates who never returned from missions. Victory was never clean, never free. But they knew their role. They knew that every bomber saved meant 10 lives spared, and every German fighter destroyed meant fewer claws waiting for the next mission. The Mustang gave them the tool, but it was their courage, their skill, and their relentless will that transformed the air war. By the summer of 1944, the laughter of the Axis had turned into something else entirely: fear. Hitler himself raged at the skies, furious that the Reich, once master of aerial warfare, was now powerless to stop the endless tide of silver bombers and their deadly escorts. The once mighty Luftwaffe was bleeding to death, its veteran corps decimated, its new recruits sent into battle with little training and no chance against the Mustangs. American bombers, though still paying a heavy price, now struck with devastating regularity, reducing German industry to ruins. Cities burned, rail lines twisted into wreckage, oil refineries shattered into flaming craters. The air war that had once seemed unwinnable was being won. One Mustang, one bomber, one mission at a time. And for those who lived it, the change was seared into memory. Ask a bomber gunner what it felt like to see a P-51 dive past his window, guns blazing, and he would tell you it was like watching death turn back on itself. Ask a Mustang pilot what it felt like to chase down a German ace who had once mocked American bombers, and he would tell you it was like rewriting the story of the skies. This was not just strategy, it was justice, carved into the clouds by courage and steel. And when the final reckoning came, when the Allies stood victorious, it was not hard to see the line that stretched from the laughter of 1943 to the silence of 1944, from the helpless bombers to the Mustangs that proved who ruled the skies. By the autumn of 1944, the skies above Europe no longer echoed with the laughter of the Axis. They were instead filled with the thunder of Allied engines and the shriek of Luftwaffe desperation. What had once been a hunting ground for German fighters was now their graveyard. The Mustang had matured from a whispered rumor to an omnipresent reality, its Merlin engine singing a song of dominance that few German pilots could challenge. Every mission seemed to carry the same brutal rhythm, bombers forming up over England in vast silver armadas, Mustangs gathering like hawks at the edges of the flock, and then the long, relentless march into the Reich. For the men in the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare they could not wake from. They scrambled from airfields already cratered by Allied raids, climbed with dwindling fuel supplies, and rose into skies where Mustangs waited above them, eager and merciless. The hunter's laugh had turned into a hunted man's silence, and with it the tone of the war shifted irreversibly. Yet even as the balance changed, the cost remained punishing. Bomber crews still counted the empty bunks after every raid, still saw men vanish in plumes of smoke, still felt the gut-wrenching weight of survival when others did not return. The Mustangs gave them hope, gave them cover, but they could not erase the horrors of flak and fire. Missions to oil plants at Mersburg, to synthetic fuel refineries, to the industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley were among the most dangerous ever flown. Flak gunners on the ground had turned their craft into an art form, filling the skies with deadly black bursts that shredded aluminum and flesh alike. And yet, even as flak tore through wings, the bomber formations kept pressing on, dropping their loads with a precision that ground commanders marveled at. It was as though the promise of daylight bombing, once derided as suicidal fantasy, was finally being fulfilled, not by bravery alone, but by the combined fury of bombers and Mustangs. For the Luftwaffe, the strain was unbearable. They were running out of fuel, out of pilots, out of time. The veterans who had once mocked American bombers were dead, captured, or too exhausted to fly. The new recruits, many teenagers barely old enough to shave, were thrown into cockpits with just a few hours of training, expected to face seasoned Mustang pilots in machines that could barely match their performance. The results were predictable and devastating. American fighters scythed through them with ruthless efficiency, turning the once proud Luftwaffe into a shadow of itself. Even German civilians, once comforted by propaganda that boasted of air superiority, began to recognize the truth. They looked up and saw endless contrails stretching across the sky, punctuated by the roar of Mustangs diving at will. Fear replaced laughter. Resignation replaced bravado. The Reich, once so confident in its mastery of the air, was crumbling before their eyes. And yet the most profound shift was not mechanical, but human. The bomber crews who had once felt abandoned now felt part of something greater, something almost unbreakable. They wrote letters home describing the sight of Mustangs streaking overhead, calling them our angels, our guardians, our saviors. Mustang pilots, in turn, spoke of the fierce pride they felt when they drove off attackers and watched the lumbering fortresses lumber homeward. There was a bond forged in those skies, an unspoken understanding between bomber crews and their escorts that transcended words. They were not just fighting for strategy or for victory. They were fighting for each other, for survival, for the chance to see another dawn. And in that unity, the Allies found a power that no Axis laughter could ever break. The Germans tried to answer with new weapons. The Me-262 jet fighter roared into the skies in late 1944, faster than anything the Allies could field. For a brief moment, it seemed like a new terror had arrived, one that might swing the pendulum back. But even the jets could not turn the tide. There were too few of them, flown by too few trained pilots, and fuel shortages crippled their operations. The Mustang pilots, bold and relentless, even learned to ambush jets on takeoff and landing, where their speed advantage was useless. The Reich's last gambles fell flat, and the skies grew ever more hostile to their defenders. By the time Allied troops marched toward the Rhine, the air war had been won, not in a single battle, but in the relentless grind of missions that wore down the Luftwaffe day by day, sortie by sortie, until the once proud guardians of the Reich were nothing more than scattered fragments of a broken force. For those who lived it, the memory was etched forever. Ask a pilot who flew Mustangs, and he would tell you that it was not just about flying a superior machine. It was about restoring faith, about turning the tide of a war that had once seemed endless. Ask a bomber crewman who survived a mission over Berlin, and he would tell you that the sight of a P-51 dropping out of the sun to clear a German fighter from his tail was the difference between life and death. The laughter of the Axis had faded into history, replaced by the silence of defeat. And as the war drew toward its conclusion, the Mustang stood as a symbol, not just of American innovation, but of Allied determination, of the refusal to yield, of the sheer audacity to take the fight into the very heart of enemy skies and emerge victorious. By early 1945, the question of who ruled the skies was no longer asked. The contrails that crisscrossed the German sky told the answer with ruthless clarity. The Reich could laugh no more. Its skies belonged to the Allies. Its cities lay in ruin. Its factories smoldered. And while victory would still demand blood on the ground, the war in the air had been decided. It was the Mustang, sleek and unstoppable, that had carried the burden of turning ridicule into dominance. For the men who flew, for the men who watched from the ground, and for the millions who would later read the history, the legacy was clear. When the Axis laughed at Allied bombers, it was the P-51 Mustang that silenced them forever. The winter of 1944 into 1945 marked the twilight of Nazi air power, a bitter season when the last embers of Luftwaffe dominance flickered against the overwhelming storm of Allied might. For those who had lived through the earlier years of the bombing campaign, the helpless climbs into German airspace when laughter and scorn seemed to echo across every mission, the transformation was almost surreal. What had once been a desperate gamble had become an unrelenting hammer, pounding the Reich with strikes so devastating that entire cities seemed to crumble overnight. The Mustang was everywhere now, its sleek frame carving lines of defiance across the cold sky. No longer was its presence a novelty whispered about in mess halls. It had become a fact of life, a constant guardian that bomber crews expected to see, like an unspoken promise written in contrails. Even the enemy knew its silhouette all too well. Where once German children had pointed to the sky, boasting of our fighters swooping to victory, now they stared upward with fear, knowing that the streak of a P-51 meant danger even before the bombers arrived. The missions of 1945 were not without terror. Berlin itself lay within reach, a target so vast, so symbolically powerful, that each raid upon it carried a sense of inevitability, as though history itself was being etched into the clouds. Bomber formations thundered toward the capital in endless waves, their bomb bays heavy with destruction, their escorts weaving above and around them like hawks circling a flock. The Luftwaffe still rose to meet them, but the contests had grown uneven. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Airfields were cratered by preemptive Allied strikes. And when the German fighters did appear, they were often outnumbered, outflown, and overwhelmed by Mustangs that seemed to descend from every direction at once. The young recruits, many barely trained, faced pilots hardened by years of combat in machines built for endurance. The result was carnage. German fighters tumbled in flames, and with each loss, the once proud air arm of the Reich bled closer to extinction. The Mustang pilots themselves understood the magnitude of their role. They knew they were not just protecting bombers, but delivering a final, suffocating blow to an enemy that had once mocked their efforts. They dove into dogfights with a confidence that was not arrogance, but a hard-earned certainty that their machine gave them the edge. They flew long hours in the cold, frost collecting on their canopies, sweat freezing inside their gloves, eyes straining against the glare of the sun. Each mission was a test of endurance, as much as of courage. Yet the P-51 rewarded their faith, carrying them deeper into enemy skies than any escort had before. For the first time, the promise of daylight precision bombing, a strategy once derided as impossible, was fully realized. And it was realized on the wings of the Mustang. For the bomber crews, the sense of relief was palpable, even if it never erased the fear. They still flew through curtains of flak, still watched squadrons vanish in bursts of smoke and fire. But the presence of Mustangs meant that each man could cling to a sliver of hope, even in the darkest hour of a mission. Stories spread through the barracks of daring rescues, a P-51 diving to clear a German fighter off a crippled bomber's tail, or circling a stricken fortress until it limped across the channel, as though refusing to abandon it. These stories were more than anecdotes. They were morale, lifelines of belief that gave meaning to the sacrifice. They turned missions from hopeless gambles into hard but winnable fights. And as the Reich weakened, as its laughter withered, the men who had once doubted the strategy of daylight bombing began to see themselves not as victims, but as victors. Still, there was no glamour in this victory. The Mustang pilots who survived often spoke of the toll it took, the endless duels, the moments when friends vanished in sudden fireballs, the loneliness of long flights home with empty spaces in formation. The bomber crews never forgot the sight of fortresses spiraling earthward, parachutes dotting the sky, or the gut-wrenching silence of a bunk left unfilled after a mission. Victory was purchased in blood, paid for by men whose names would be etched into rosters of the missing or the dead. Yet through that sacrifice, something extraordinary was achieved. The silencing of the Axis laugh, the reversal of a narrative that had once seemed unshakable. Germany had promised that its skies were impregnable, that Allied bombers would be slaughtered, that the Reich would endure. But in the end, the contrails over Berlin told a different story, one written in silver wings and Mustang roars. The psychological effect on the ground was immense. German civilians who had once cheered the Luftwaffe's defiance now huddled in fear, their confidence shattered. They saw Allied bombers march over their cities day after day, escorted by fighters that no German ace seemed able to stop. They saw their factories burn, their transportation grind to a halt, their once invincible Reich reduced to rubble and silence. Propaganda could not cover the truth. The sound of Merlin engines overhead was proof enough that the Reich no longer ruled the skies. And for the Allies, the laughter that had once mocked them was now their own, the grim, weary laughter of men who had survived the worst and now watched the enemy falter. By the time the Red Army pressed into the east and Allied troops crossed the Rhine, the air war was already decided. The Luftwaffe was broken, its laughter silenced, its skies no longer safe. The P-51 Mustang had carried the burden of that transformation, not alone, but as the decisive edge that turned hope into certainty. It had rewritten the rules of daylight bombing, restored faith to crews who had once flown to near-certain death, and driven fear into an enemy that had once boasted of supremacy. When the end came in May 1945, it was written not just on the ground, but in the air, where the laughter of the Axis had been silenced forever by the roar of Mustangs. As the war edged into its final months, the dominance of the skies was no longer in question. The Axis had stopped laughing. What remained was not defiance, but desperation, a frantic attempt to scrape together whatever fragments of air power still existed to defend a collapsing Reich. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shell of its former self. Its legendary aces had been thinned out by years of relentless combat, while fuel shortages and destroyed factories crippled the ability to replace losses. Young boys, some scarcely out of school, were being shoved into cockpits, their training reduced to a handful of hours before being hurled into battles they could not possibly win. Against them came waves of American bombers escorted by Mustangs, whose pilots were hardened veterans, flying machines that had proven themselves not only capable of reaching Berlin, but able to linger, to hunt, to dominate. Each clash told the same story. Untrained German pilots plunging bravely but hopelessly into formations they had no chance of breaking, while P-51s sliced through them with precision and ruthless efficiency. What had once been laughter at defenseless bombers had become bitter silence at the realization that the skies were now hostile territory for the Reich. The Allied High Command understood the importance of pressing this advantage. Missions were no longer about survival, but about suffocation, choking every last breath of resistance from the German war machine. The Mustang squadrons expanded their roles. They strafed airfields, catching aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. They shredded railway lines, convoys, and fuel depots, ensuring that what remained of the Luftwaffe starved before it could fight. For bomber crews, the difference was night and day compared to the early years. Once missions had been measured by the number of aircraft lost, whole squadrons vanishing in fire and smoke. Now losses still occurred, but they were no longer wholesale slaughter. The Mustangs had tipped the balance so completely that the bomber offensive became a relentless juggernaut. Grinding down what the Reich had once boasted was invincible. For civilians under the bombing routes, the change was also undeniable. German towns and cities, already scarred by years of raids, now watched the sky in mute terror as swarms of bombers and escorts appeared daily. No one could pretend that the Reich had control. Children no longer played at pointing out Messerschmitts. They huddled in shelters, listening to the whistle of bombs and the scream of strafing Mustangs tearing through rail yards. The propaganda machine, once full of mocking posters and boasts of Allied futility, grew hollow, its promises shattered by the constant reality of Allied dominance overhead. In their place came whispered rumors, weary admissions, and finally resignation. The laughter was gone, and in its place lingered the quiet dread of a nation realizing its own end. Among the Allied airmen, there was no triumphalism, only the grim determination to finish what had been so costly to begin. Mustang pilots wrote letters home about endless sorties, about the numbing repetition of combat, about friends who disappeared in fireballs and were never seen again. For the bomber crews, the relief of Escort was tempered by the constant danger of flak, the inevitability of missions that ended in smoke and loss. Yet all of them knew they were part of something larger than themselves. They were writing the final chapters of a story that had once seemed doomed, a story in which the Axis laughed and mocked their courage. Now every mile flown over enemy territory was a rebuttal. Every bomb dropped a statement that the Reich's arrogance had been misplaced. Every Mustang dive, a reminder that history was no longer theirs to command. The Mustang's impact went far beyond tactics and missions. It was symbolic, a physical embodiment of the Allied refusal to bow to fear or ridicule. Its long-range reach represented not just technical triumph, but moral endurance, a machine born of necessity that had given men the courage to face impossible odds and survive. It was not perfection. Pilots still died, bombers still burned, and cities still became graveyards, but it was decisive. Where once the question of daylight bombing had seemed madness, now it was doctrine. Where once the skies of Europe had been a battlefield tilted in favor of the Axis, now they were an arena of Allied supremacy. The laughter of the Luftwaffe was gone, replaced by silence. And in that silence, the Allies found vindication. By March of 1945, as Allied armies advanced across the Rhine and the Reich began to unravel on the ground, the air war had already been won. The Mustang had helped pave the way, ensuring that German defenses were crippled long before the tanks rolled into cities. Entire industrial regions lay in ruins, rail networks shattered, fuel depots smoking craters. The Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft often never left the ground, their frames abandoned on airstrips bombed into rubble. The few that did take off often failed to return. The Mustang had not won the war alone, no single weapon could, but it had ensured that one of Hitler's greatest boasts, the supremacy of the skies, had been utterly broken. And in that breaking, the war's end became inevitable. For those who flew, for those who watched from the ground, and for those who lived through the transition from ridicule to dominance, the memory of that change never faded. They remembered the days when Axis laughter seemed cruelly accurate, when every mission felt like a sentence to death. And they remembered the day that laughter stopped, silenced by the steady growl of engines that promised salvation. The P-51 Mustang had proven who ruled the skies, and its echo carried far beyond 1945. When the guns at last began to fall silent in the spring of 1945, the story of the skies was already written in contrails and ashes. Germany lay broken, its cities scarred by years of relentless bombing, its railways twisted metal, its factories reduced to charred skeletons. The Luftwaffe, the pride of Hitler's vision, once paraded before the world as an unstoppable force, was a memory. In its place were wrecked airframes scattered across ruined fields, young pilots who had perished before their lives had even begun, and the silence of a nation that no longer dared to look skyward. For the Allies, the victory was undeniable, but it was steeped in reflection as much as in triumph. Men who had once flown into battle, hearing the mocking laughter of Axis voices, now carried with them the knowledge that they had silenced it at great cost. The P-51 Mustang had not only changed the course of the war, it had changed them. Its arrival had turned terror into hope, but that hope had been paid for in the blood of comrades, lost in fire and smoke. The Mustang's legacy became inseparable from the broader story of daylight bombing. What had begun as a controversial strategy, daring, even reckless, was proven feasible only because of the long-range escort that arrived in time to carry it through to victory. Without the P-51, the toll on bomber crews might have been so catastrophic that the Allies would have abandoned the effort. Without the P-51, the factories fueling the German war machine might have remained intact far longer, prolonging the conflict, perhaps even changing its outcome. Instead, history bent under the wings of a machine that combined British engineering with American manufacturing might, flown by men who had faced scorn and ridicule and come out triumphant. In every sense, the Mustang was a symbol of Allied cooperation and resilience. a weapon born of necessity that became a legend. Yet in the reflective silence of peace, the airmen who had lived through it often spoke less of glory and more of memory. Pilots recalled the empty bunks of comrades who never returned, the smell of burned metal that lingered after a mission, the quiet prayers whispered as flak burst around their formations. They remembered German pilots too, sometimes boys, sometimes desperate veterans who had fought bravely in impossible odds. The sky was a battlefield, but it was also a graveyard, and those who survived carried its weight long after the war had ended. The Mustang, for all its brilliance, was still part of that graveyard, a harbinger of destruction that had broken one tyranny but also left entire cities in ruins. Its legend was inseparable from both liberation and loss, a reminder that every victory in war carries a shadow. For the civilians of Europe, the sound of its Merlin engine meant many things. To some, it was deliverance, the sign that the end of Nazi rule was near. To others, it was terror, the herald of bombs that would leave their homes in rubble. And yet, decades later, when veterans gathered to speak of those days, the Mustang was remembered not in bitterness, but in awe. It had been beautiful, deadly and decisive, and it had changed the rhythm of the war itself. Even German survivors admitted as much, acknowledging that once the P-51 entered the skies, the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed. The laughter that had once mocked Allied bombers was replaced by silence. And in that silence, the Allies carved their path to victory. As Europe began to rebuild, the Mustang's role was celebrated across oceans and nations. Airfields once muddy and temporary gave way to monuments. Aircraft once lined up for combat were preserved in museums, polished and painted, reminders of a time when the fate of nations hung on the wings of a fighter. Pilots, who had once strapped themselves into its cockpits, now stood beside it in old age, touching its skin with reverence, remembering the youth they had left behind in its service. For them, the Mustang was not just metal and engines, it was memory, brotherhood, sacrifice, and survival. It was the sound of courage in the face of scorn, the answer to laughter that once seemed cruelly justified. And so the Mustang became more than a weapon. It became a story told in documentaries, in books, in the hushed tones of veterans who still dreamed of contrails and sunlight flashing off wings. A story of how mockery turned to silence, of how a single innovation could change the tide of war, of how determination and endurance could turn despair into dominance. Every roar of its Merlin engine was an echo of that transformation, a reminder of the moment the Allies proved who truly ruled the skies. The Axis had laughed once. They had pointed to the lumbering bombers and sneered that they were flying coffins, doomed to be torn apart. But history has no place for arrogance without power to sustain it. The laughter was silenced, the skies reclaimed, and the P-51 Mustang etched its name into eternity as the answer to ridicule, the weapon that turned scorn into silence. And in that silence, the world began to rebuild, carrying forward the lesson that courage, innovation, and unity could reshape the very course of history.